This is Wild of Africa on WION Wild is One. Welcome to the show with me, Eric Njoka. Africa. This one word is sufficient to evoke images of a doomed people. Africa's population is largely ill-insured against external shocks brought about by natural disasters, adverse climate, war, and even conflict. There are many who are offended when the media reports that the region is plagued by many problems which hurt its ability to ensure food and nutrition security for its people. The situation seems to repeat itself year in, year out. But we are not here to talk about what we already know. In reality, the continent continues to suffer immensely, yet the West or aid organizations haven't stopped pledging funds, each disaster with its own share or promise. It has become too obvious nowadays. However, where does all the money go? We believe it is time for Africans to get the answers to this pertinent question. Watch this next special report and know why we insist Africa must wake and stand up now.
It's been 3 months since the year 2023 began, but there's nothing new about the worsening climate change and its impact on humans. In fact, it's getting worse. After battering Madagascar in late February, Cyclone Freddy wreaked havoc in Malawi and Mozambique when it made a second landfall within weeks. Locals, officials and aid workers continue to uncover the full extent of destruction in what may be the longest-lasting tropical cyclone on record. In Malawi, the death toll crossed over 500, with close to 400,000 people still displaced. Before Freddy, Malawi experienced its deadliest cholera outbreak. It is feared that floodwaters could worsen the situation in terms of accessing clean water and sanitation. In Mozambique, at least 66 died and nearly 59,000 were displaced. Those who survived the fury now face another danger: lack of food. The United Nations has continuously deplored the effects of climate change. It predicts that the worst is yet to come.
Humanity is on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast. As today's report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, details, humans are responsible for virtually all global heating over the last 200 years. The rate of temperature rise in the last half-century is the highest in 2,000 years. Concentrations of carbon dioxide are at their highest in at least 2 million years. The climate time bomb is ticking.
The Horn of Africa is bearing the brunt of record drought for years. The situation is not getting any better, as 43,000 people were killed in Somalia last year, half of them children under 5.
People became weak because of hunger, so we had to flee for our lives. I came to this camp in Baidoa during the month of Ramadan. My wife died of hunger here, and I became helpless. All my livestock and crops were also wiped out.
Across Africa, from east to west, people are experiencing a food crisis that is bigger and more complex than the continent has ever seen. According to data from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, 1 in 5 Africans, a record 278 million, were already facing hunger or famine in 2021. It says the situation has worsened. East Africa has missed 4 consecutive rainy seasons, the worst drought in 40 years. Nearly 22 million people across Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia face high levels of acute food insecurity, a number projected to rise up to 26 million by mid-2023 if the rains fail again. In Chad, over 19,000 head of livestock was swept away as floods ravaged the country. In neighboring Nigeria, flooding hit 29 of the 36 states by the end of last year. The rains continue to pour this year. More countries in the west and east are experiencing a change in the weather patterns. This deluge has cut off supplies of food to remote regions. Then there is conflict, which has long been a driver of hunger. War forces civilians from their homes, livelihoods, farms and food sources. It also makes it dangerous to deliver assistance. The number of displaced people in Africa has tripled over the past decade to a record 36 million in 2022, according to UN data that represents almost half of the displaced people in the world. Most were displaced internally within their own countries by conflict. According to the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, a crisis monitoring group, conflicts are worsening across the continent.
We want to bear witness in the face of a situation which is intolerable, which is not acceptable. What is happening here in Eastern Congo is unacceptable. What is happening in Eastern Congo must be brought to light. This is the reason for our presence here. This is the reason for this humanitarian airdrop. This is the reason for our diplomatic and political investment that accompanies this humanitarian bridge.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February last year, which Moscow called a special military operation, added to Africa's problems. All the global bodies, including the UN, WHO and EU, moved their focus to the war and neglected Africa's woes. Disruptions caused by that war also resulted in fertilizer shortage. Where stocks are available, prices have risen beyond the means of many farmers. The result will be smaller harvests this year in West Africa. The World Food Programme estimates cereal production could fall by 20%. 4 of the 5 African countries receiving the most humanitarian funding under the 2022 aid appeal are located in or border the drought-stricken Horn of Africa region. The US announced billions of dollars in additional humanitarian assistance to address acute food insecurity in Africa. The country pledged an additional $2.5 billion in emergency assistance and medium to long-term food security assistance. The United Nations followed suit and made a similar pledge at the 36th African Union Summit in Ethiopia last year.
Around the world today, 339 million people are in need of humanitarian aid, an increase of more than 25% since last year. And so today, here in Addis, I'm announcing the largest ever allocation from our United Nations Central Emergency Response Fund, $250 million, to combat famine and to address unfunded emergencies.
Though many critics still question the disbursement of these funds, African governments have done little to prevent food crises from recurring. In a move to boost production, reduce import reliance and improve food security, leaders in 2003 pledged to commit at least 10% of their national budgets to agriculture and rural development within 5 years. By 2021, nearly 2 decades later, just 2 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Mali and Zimbabwe, met that target. Agriculture makes up nearly 20% of Africa's GDP, and more than half of Africans work in the sector. Most of this is low-productivity subsistence farming, and the region is a net importer of staples, including wheat, palm oil and rice. Productivity and crop yields have increased, but agricultural production per capita is falling. Self-sufficiency for major commodities is decreasing. Without action, the World Bank says Africa's food import bill, which stood at $43 billion in 2019, could rise to $110 billion in 2025. Africa's woes seem to be far from over, and the deplorable famine disaster persists. Bureau Report, WION World is One.